Ever since I've been watching videos on other platforms other than YouTube, there's a common trend that videos, if uploaded at high resolutions, will almost always be downscaled to 480p. This may seem like a problem as you've worked so hard and used a decent quality 1080p camera and good sound equipment to capture good audio, only for it to be downsized to 480p video and have the audio compressed to 128 kilobits per second ACC. And then you're probably wondering, why even use 480p when 1080p is the standard resolution of most computer monitors and phone screens? Well, that is the reason why I'm writing this essay. To answer the question as to why 480p still exists, despite HD and FHD content having existed since the late 1990s, has to do with a system of compromises that stem from both monetary and logistics and other experience. For this essay, 480p will be referring to either resolutions of 854 by 480 and 640 by 480 pixels. And to compare that with HD content, which is 1280 by 720, and FHD content, which is 1920 by 1080, 480p is less than half the detail of 720p. So what is the compromise and logistical challenge? The compromises and logistical challenges have to do with the file sizes and bit rates for these resolutions and the money needed to pay for the bandwidth to send that data over to the user end of video. Smaller companies that host video sharing that don't have the same level of resources as YouTube have to make compromises of having to work with limited bandwidth and other user experience. If the server has to deliver a 1080p video over limited bandwidth to a bunch of viewers, the bandwidth to send a 1080p is 5 times that of sending 480p video with similar compression quality. This also increases the chance a server will lag and impact the user experience in a negative way and make the video potentially not load at all because of the lack of bandwidth. However, resolutions should also not be too low, such as 240p, where the quality is noticeably terrible and pixelated, making it a poor option despite only using 10% of the bandwidth as 1080p. So the solution lies somewhere in between, with 480p, which is good enough for most mobile and web applications. Then you might be asking, how is 480p good enough for most mobile and web applications when my 4K TV 480p looks terrible? And for TV applications, you would be correct. However, because mobile screens tend to be less than 6 inches across, and videos on web pages barely take up the whole screen of a desktop, you would not be able to see the detail lost from a lower resolution unless you have very good eyesight. If you don't believe me, take a look at your phone screen setting to see if it's capable of changing the screen resolution. If it is, see if you can tell much of a difference between 720p and 1080p, and the chances that you won't see much of a difference despite 720p only having half the level of detail as 1080p. However, there is somewhat noticeable difference between 720p and 480p, but it is not nearly as extreme as the difference between 720p and 480p on a bigger screen. However, that's not the only reason 480p is good for mobile. Mobile devices, when connected to cell towers, tend to have very limited bandwidth for video when out of the city, and oftentimes falls between 3 and 5 megabits per second, with current video compression algorithms for videos to use less bandwidth and take up less space, and most common algorithms being H.264 codec. 480p can have a relatively good compression image quality at bit rates as low as 2 megabits per second, where 1080p's high level of detail requires exponentially higher bit rate of 20 to 30 megabits per second to be considered good quality. That is why it is oftentimes better to watch a classic movie on Blu-ray as opposed to streaming, because 1080p will oftentimes be compressed to 12 megabits per second, while Blu-ray generally runs at 40, making Blu-ray discs have far superior quality to streaming, as well as Blu-ray supporting lossless audio, because limited bandwidth is not a serious issue with Blu-ray discs. The audio is also something that just as important, if not more important, to video quality as image quality. For example, you can have a beautiful shot 4K movie on very good TV, but if the sound quality is terrible, it will ruin the whole experience, and the better sound quality is something that can fit more easily with bandwidth saving using 480p, such as setting the streaming quality to 320 kilobits per second AAC audio, which is much closer to lossless than 128 kilobits per second AAC audio, and that is in most streaming videos. However, if lossless audio is what you want, it's better to edit the sound separate from the video and save as a WAV or FLAC file before adding it to the video and using compression algorithms that don't use a lossy audio codec. However, I don't see many mobile applications use audio bit rates higher than 128 kilobits per second AAC because most mobile devices have tiny speakers that can't put out the same dynamic range as a dedicated speaker or high-quality headphones, so the lossiness would be hardly noticeable. However, if it's going to be viewed on a web page, then it is better to use a higher bitrate audio or use lossless codec like FLAC or WAV because people use desktops or laptops on the internet generally have a much better speakers than a phone speaker. And if you ever listened to a low bitrate 64 kilobits per second MP3 file on good headphones, the types of imperfections that come with a lossy audio codec I'm talking about are very noticeable and annoying. So to conclude it all, 480p still has its place in the video format, albeit for specific types of applications. If bandwidth is a real concern and cost to keep a server, 480p is a better choice. But if the quality and cinematics and daily offline applications are the focus, 1080p and 4K are far superior to 480p in almost every way. And that concludes my essay why 480p is still relevant. I hope you learned something useful.